Before we start, please let me know where you're listening from. It will be nice to feel closer, even if we're physically apart. Also, don't forget to like and comment on what you thought about this near-death experience testimony. Let's have a fair and open discussion so we can learn from each other on this channel. Enjoy listening. My name is Sarah Montgomery, and I was born and raised in a devoted Christian family in a small town in Georgia. I'm 42 years old now, but it was just 3 years ago that everything changed. I was working as a respiratory therapist at a local hospital, and the day I died and met Jesus began like any other day. I woke up, had my coffee, said my morning prayers, and headed to work for my 12-hour shift. Around 2 p.m., while helping a patient with COPD adjust his oxygen levels, I felt a sudden crushing pain in my chest. It radiated down my left arm and up into my jaw. I recognized the symptoms immediately. I was having a major heart attack. I remember collapsing, hearing my patient calling for help, and the rush of my colleagues around me. Then everything went dark. The moment my heart stopped, I felt a strange sensation, like floating upward. The pain that had been overwhelming just seconds before completely vanished. I found myself looking down at the chaotic scene below, my body lying still on the table, doctors and nurses working frantically, the defibrillator being charged, the monitor showing a flat line. I wasn't afraid. Instead, I felt an inexplicable peace washing over me. Then I noticed a bright light to my right. It started small but grew in intensity, though strangely, it wasn't blinding or harsh. It felt warm and inviting, radiating a love so pure and complete that I felt drawn to it. As I moved toward the light, I became aware of a presence. Then I saw him. Jesus stood before me, not exactly as the paintings portray him, but I recognized him instantly. It wasn't his appearance that made me certain, it was the overwhelming sense of love, truth, and power that radiated from him. His eyes held wisdom beyond anything I could comprehend, and when he looked at me, I felt completely known, every flaw, every sin, every good deed, and yet completely loved. "Sarah," he said, and his voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, "your time has not yet come. There is work I have for you to do. But first, I must show you what few have seen." Before I could respond, the scene around us shifted, and we were standing in a hospital corridor. It looked like Mercy General, but somehow different, as if I could see beyond the physical. "What you are about to witness happens every day in hospitals around the world," Jesus explained. "Most cannot see it, but it affects everyone. Look with spiritual eyes now." The corridor stretched before us, bathed in a chilly, almost unreal light. At first glance, it appeared normal, doctors and nurses moving purposefully, patients in rooms, family members in waiting areas. But then my vision seemed to deepen, like looking through a veil to what was really happening. Dark shapes moved through the corridors, not shadows cast by people or objects, but actual entities. They were formless and shifting, like smoke that had awareness and purpose. They lingered outside certain rooms, especially where patients were critically ill. "What are they?" I asked, though I didn't speak aloud. "They are manifestations of darkness," Jesus answered. "Some are drawn to suffering and fear. Others are deliberately invited in, sometimes unknowingly, by those whose hearts harbor negativity or who engage in practices that open doorways to them." I watched as these dark entities moved from room to room. Some seemed to be searching, while others waited patiently outside specific doorways. "Why are they here?" "Hospitals exist at the threshold between life and death," Jesus explained. "They are places of transition, where souls can be most vulnerable. These entities seek to influence those transitions. Some feed on fear and suffering. Others seek to separate souls from their bodies before their appointed time." As we walked, I noticed that the patients in the rooms seemed different too. Their faces were marked by suffering, but what struck me most was the absence of hope in many of their eyes. They looked resigned, as if waiting for an inevitable end. "Without hope, without faith, people become vulnerable," Jesus said, sensing my thoughts. "Fear creates openings for darkness to enter." Then Jesus guided me to a room where an elderly woman lay connected to various machines. Her daughter sat beside her, holding her hand. On the surface, it appeared to be a touching scene of family devotion. "Look deeper," Jesus instructed. When I focused, I could see dark, smoke-like tendrils connecting the daughter to her mother. The daughter's face showed concern, but I could now perceive the emotions churning inside her: resentment, impatience, a secret wish for her mother's suffering to end, not just for mercy's sake but so her own life could return to normal. Her negative emotions are creating an entry point, Jesus explained. She doesn't realize that her thoughts and feelings are manifesting spiritually. Her bitterness has become a doorway that allows darkness to drain her mother's life force. But she loves her mother, I protested. Love mixed with resentment becomes tainted, Jesus replied. Many families experience this. The burden of care becomes heavy, and negative emotions arise. These emotions, if not recognized and surrendered, become weapons that darkness can use. The daughter doesn't intend harm, but intention isn't always necessary for harm to occur. I watched as dark entities hovered nearby, seeming to feed on the negative energy flowing between mother and daughter. This happens in countless rooms every day, Jesus continued. Family members who unknowingly project their fatigue, their resentment, their desire for an end to suffering onto the patient. These emotions materialize as forces that can actually hasten decline. What can be done? I asked, horrified by the implication. Awareness is the first step, Jesus said. Those who visit the sick must guard their hearts and minds. They must be conscious of what energy they bring into the room. A simple prayer before entering can create protection. Speaking words of life and hope, rather than resignation, can drive away darkness. Then we moved to another wing of the hospital. Jesus stopped outside a room where a young man lay recovering from surgery. Not all who wear the uniform of healers are working for healing, Jesus said. A nurse entered the room. Her movements seemed normal, professional. She checked the patient's vitals, adjusted his and administered medication. But with my enhanced vision, I could see that some of her movements had a ritual-like quality to them. Subtle gestures, whispered words under her breath. Watch carefully, Jesus instructed. As she touched the patient's arm to check his pulse, I saw dark energy flow from her fingers into his body. Where she touched him, a mark appeared, not visible to normal eyes, but glowing darkly on the spiritual plane I was witnessing. She is a willing participant, Jesus explained. She practices dark arts outside the hospital and brings them into her work. The medications she administers are correct, her technical care is proper, but she adds something extra, rituals and incantations that open doorways for entities to affect the patient. How can this happen? I asked, appalled. How can no one notice? The physical and spiritual realms operate simultaneously, Jesus replied. Most can only perceive the physical. They see a competent nurse performing routine care. They don't see the spiritual component of her actions. We moved to another room, where a doctor was examining a patient. Not all influence is deliberately malicious, Jesus continued. Watch this physician. The doctor seemed distracted, frustrated. As he examined the patient, I could see dark clouds surrounding him, emanating from his own state of mind. This doctor is not malevolent, Jesus explained. He has no knowledge of the spiritual realm. But his burnout, his compassion fatigue, his growing cynicism act as carriers for negative energy. When he touches patients without hope or compassion, he unintentionally transfers that energy to them. That's terrible, I said. How many healers actually harm without knowing it? Many, Jesus replied sadly. Medicine has forgotten that humans are body, mind, and spirit. When only the body is treated, while the mind and spirit are ignored or even damaged, healing is incomplete at best, and harmful at worst. Then Jesus led me to the intensive care unit, a department where patients hovered between life and death. The spiritual activity here was intense. Dark entities clustered thickly around certain beds, while others seemed protected by a light that kept the darkness at bay. Here is where the battle is most evident, Jesus said. We approached a bed where a middle-aged man lay in a coma. The machines showed weak but stable vital signs. His family had gathered around his bed, speaking in hushed tones. Listen to their words, Jesus instructed. It's time to let go, one family member said. Your suffering will be over soon, said another. We're ready to say goodbye, a third added. With each statement, I saw the dark entities around the bed grow stronger, more substantial. They seemed to feed on the words of resignation and farewell. Words have power in the spiritual realm, Jesus explained. These family members believe they're being kind, giving permission for their loved one to die. They don't realize they're actually speaking death over him, inviting these entities to help separate his soul from his body before his appointed time. That's horrifying, I said. They think they're doing the right thing. Many do, Jesus agreed. They've been taught that it's compassionate to let go, to say goodbye, to end suffering. And there are times when it is a person's appointed time to die. But often, these words are spoken prematurely, out of the family's exhaustion or discomfort with waiting, not because it's truly time. A hospital chaplain entered the room. He greeted the family warmly, then asked if he could pray for the patient. They agreed, and he placed his hand gently on the man's forehead. As he prayed, I saw light emanating from his hand, pushing back the darkness. The dark entities recoiled, and the patient's spirit, which I could now see was hovering uncertainty between his body and what lay beyond, seemed to strengthen. Simple faith has power, Jesus said. A prayer spoken with belief can drive back darkness that medicine cannot touch. Then Jesus guided me to the pediatric wing, where we entered the room of a small girl, perhaps 18 months old. She was pale, connected to breathing machines. She fell into a pool, Jesus told me. Drowning, asphyxia. The paramedics resuscitated her, but her heart is weak, her body suspended between life and death. An elderly woman sat beside the bed, the child's grandmother. She held the little girl's wrist tightly in one hand. A yellow cloth was draped across the child's chest, and the grandmother was muttering words I couldn't quite hear. What is she doing? She believes she's helping, Jesus explained. She's mixing truth with falsehood, faith with superstition. She thinks she's driving out evil, but she's actually opening doors to it. I looked closer and saw dark energy swirling from the grandmother's hands into the child. Where she gripped the girl's wrist, a mark was forming, not a physical bruise, but a spiritual brand. The grandmother practices folk magic, Jesus continued. She learned these rituals from her mother, who learned them from hers. They call it old wisdom, traditional healing, family secrets. They don't understand they're channeling darkness rather than light. As we watched, a nurse entered the room. She paused, looking troubled, then asked the grandmother to step outside while she checked the child's vital signs. The grandmother reluctantly complied. Once alone with the girl, the nurse gently removed the yellow cloth. She frowned at the mark on the child's wrist, which had begun to manifest physically as a slight discoloration. The nurse placed her hand on the child's forehead and whispered a simple prayer. "Father, protect this child," she said softly. Light spread from her hand, and I saw the dark mark on the child's wrist begin to fade. "Not all can see what you're seeing now," Jesus told me, "but many can sense when something is wrong. They feel the heaviness, the oppression. Those whose hearts are open to my spirit often intervene without fully understanding what they're fighting." When the grandmother returned, she immediately noticed the missing cloth. Her face darkened. "Where is it?" she demanded. "She needs it for protection." "I'm sorry," the nurse replied calmly. "Outside items aren't permitted in this unit due to infection control protocols." I could see the grandmother's anger manifesting as dark swirls of energy around her. "You don't understand," she insisted. "Without it, she's vulnerable." "She's receiving the best medical care," the nurse assured her. "The doctors are hopeful." The grandmother leaned in close to the nurse, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Evil doesn't vanish just because you wish it away." The nurse maintained her composure, but I could see she recognized the darkness in the grandmother's words. She called for the head nurse, who arrived quickly and assessed the situation. "I understand your concern for your granddaughter," the head nurse said firmly but kindly. "But I need to ask you to step out for a while. Only parents are permitted at this time." The grandmother's face contorted with anger, but she complied, walking slowly from the room as if reluctant to leave her work unfinished. "The spiritual battle for this child isn't over," Jesus told me. "But light is prevailing." Then Jesus took me to another floor of the hospital, where we entered a room occupied by a woman in her late 30s. According to the chart at the foot of her bed, her name was Stacy Thompson. She was admitted with unexplained neurological symptoms, Jesus explained. Seizures, paralysis, periods of unresponsiveness. The tests show nothing physically wrong. Stacy lay still, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. A doctor entered, followed by 2 nurses. Watch carefully, Jesus instructed. Not everything that appears medical is truly medicinal. The doctor spoke to the nurses about a new protocol they would try. His words sounded technical medical, but as I watched him prepare, I noticed his movements had that same ritualistic quality I'd seen before. He placed his stethoscope on specific points of Stacy's body, not the standard locations for heart and lung sounds, but points that seemed to form a pattern. As he touched each point, he murmured words that sounded Latin-based but weren't standard medical terminology. He's performing a ritual disguised as medicine, Jesus explained. He uses medical instruments as tools for channeling darkness. The nurses don't recognize what's happening. They see only a doctor trying an unconventional approach for a difficult case. Dark energy flowed from the doctor's hands into Stacy's body with each touch. I could see her spirit growing dimmer, as if being suppressed. She is not meant to die yet, Jesus said. But darkness is trying to claim her. Remember her, you will meet her again. The doctor completed his examination and left orders for the nurses to follow, specific times to administer medications, particular positions in which to place the patient, certain phrases to say while providing care. All of it seemed medical on the surface, but carried dark intentions beneath. This happens more than anyone realizes, Jesus told me. Not with most medical professionals. The vast majority are genuinely committed to healing. But those who practice darkness seek positions that give them access to the vulnerable. A hospital is an ideal place for such work. We continued our journey through the hospital, and Jesus showed me something else to watch for, objects that served as anchors for negative energy. In one room, a small stone tucked under a mattress. In another, a paper with strange symbols folded and hidden in a pillowcase. In a third, a seemingly innocent figurine placed on a windowsill by a visitor. These objects serve as entry points and anchors, Jesus explained. They're placed deliberately to allow continuous access for entities that would otherwise be driven away by prayer or positive energy. I noticed that in rooms with these objects, patients seemed to decline despite receiving appropriate medical care. They developed infections that wouldn't resolve, experienced pain that couldn't be controlled, or simply failed to improve without explanation. Those who work in healthcare should be vigilant, Jesus said. Unusual objects, unexpected gifts, items that appear mysteriously, these should be removed. Not everything that enters a hospital room brings healing. As we continued walking, the hospital scene expanded. Suddenly we weren't in a specific wing or room, we were everywhere at once. Every corridor, every room, every operating theater was connected by an invisible thread. I could see dark entities moving throughout the entire complex, communicating with each other, coordinating their efforts. This is a spiritual network, Jesus explained. Just as hospitals have systems that connect all parts, electronic records, communication devices, pneumatic tubes, so too does darkness have its connections. I watched as entities moved from one critically ill patient to another, concentrating their efforts where they sensed vulnerability. Some patients were surrounded by so much darkness that their life force seemed to be draining away visibly. Others had a protective light around them that kept the entities at bay. What determines who is protected and who is vulnerable? Many factors, Jesus replied. Faith is the strongest protection, not just the patient's faith, but the faith of those around them. Prayer creates shields that darkness cannot penetrate. Love, genuine, selfless love, generates light that repels these entities. He showed me a patient who, despite serious illness, was surrounded by a protective radiance. This woman has people praying for her continuously, Jesus explained. They may not see the battle, but their prayers are creating a barrier that darkness cannot cross. In contrast, he showed me another patient whose room was filled with family members who argued constantly, blamed each other for the patient's condition, and brought their negativity into the healing space. Dark entities clustered thickly in the room, feeding on the discord. Hospitals should be places of healing for body, mind, and spirit, Jesus said. Instead, they've become battlegrounds where darkness seeks to exploit vulnerability. Most medical professionals focus exclusively on the physical, leaving patients unprotected on other levels. Jesus showed me how to recognize those who knowingly or unknowingly worked for darkness in medical settings. Some signs are subtle, he explained. Watch for those who always seem to be present when patients take unexpected turns for the worse. Those who prefer to work alone with vulnerable patients. Those who use unusual phrases or perform small rituals disguised as routine care. We observed a technician drawing blood from a patient. As he worked, he whispered words under his breath while making small, unnecessary movements with his fingers, gestures that seemed like nervous habits but were actually intentional signs. He is marking patients for attention from entities, Jesus explained. Not all who do this are fully aware of what they're doing. Some have been deceived, taught practices they believe are beneficial or protective, not recognizing the darkness they channel. We watched a nursing assistant who moved from room to room, spreading negativity through complaints, dire predictions, and discouraging words. She thinks she's just being realistic, Jesus said. She doesn't realize her words are weapons that weaken patients' will to recover. Then he showed me something more disturbing, a doctor who appeared completely normal, professional, and competent, but who mentally selected certain patients for what he considered mercy. He believes some lives are not worth preserving, Jesus explained. He makes small adjustments to care, nothing obvious, nothing that would raise alarms, but enough to prevent recovery in those he deems better off dead. He considers himself compassionate, not recognizing the darkness that has corrupted his thinking. Then Jesus explained that certain moments in hospital care were particularly vulnerable to spiritual interference. Transitions are key points, he said. Admission, when a patient first enters the hospital environment. Surgical procedures, when consciousness is suspended. Moments of crisis, when decisions about care are made. And especially the approach to death, when the soul prepares to leave the body. We observed an operating room during surgery. The patient lay unconscious while the surgical team worked. Dark entities hovered around the room, more concentrated than I'd seen elsewhere. During surgery, the spirit partially detaches from the body, Jesus explained. This creates vulnerability if there's no protection in place. That's why pre-surgical prayer is so important, though few recognize its true purpose. I noticed one surgeon who began each procedure with a brief moment of silence and a barely perceptible prayer. Around his patients, a subtle light created a barrier that the entities couldn't cross. He doesn't fully understand what he's doing, Jesus told me. He was taught this practice by his mentor and continues it out of respect and tradition. Yet his simple act of faith creates powerful protection. Then Jesus brought me back to Stacy's room. Her condition had deteriorated further. The monitors showed weakening vital signs, and dark entities surrounded her bed, more concentrated than before. They seemed to be pulling at her spirit, trying to separate it from her body. You will meet her when you return, Jesus told me. Watch carefully now, so you'll know what to do. Stacy's mother sat beside the bed, weeping softly. A nurse entered, the same one who had participated in the doctor's ritual earlier. She checked the monitors, adjusted medication, and spoke reassuringly to the mother. But I could see dark energy flowing from her hands into Stacy's body with each touch. When you meet Stacy, you will recognize this nurse, Jesus said. Remember what you're seeing now. Then he showed me what would happen in the future, myself entering this very room, recognizing the spiritual battle taking place, and knowing what to do. I saw myself positioning myself at the right side of Stacy's head, standing firm despite the oppressive atmosphere. I saw a woman entering the room, a believer who understood what was happening. Together, we began to sing hymns and declare the victory and power of Christ's name. The dark entities recoiled from the sound. The nurse stiffened, her previously professional demeanor transforming into a sneer of anger. She backed away, then turned and left the room. This is what you will do, Jesus confirmed. You will recognize the battle and you will fight it with the weapons of light, prayer, worship, and the power of my name. Jesus then gave me specific instructions for how to combat these dark influences in hospitals. First, understand that what you've seen is real, even though most cannot see it. Trust your spiritual instincts when something feels wrong in a medical setting. Second, pray before entering hospitals, not just for healing, but for protection and discernment. Create a shield of prayer that encompasses anyone you visit. Third, speak of life, not death. Even when medical prognosis is poor, speak of hope, healing, and God's power. Your words create an atmosphere where either light or darkness can thrive. Fourth, be alert to unusual objects, marks, or rituals in hospital rooms. Question things that don't seem right. Remove objects that appear mysteriously or that give you a sense of unease. Fifth, watch for those who bring heaviness with them, visitors or staff whose presence seems to drain rather than strengthen the sick. Limit their access when possible. Sixth, remember that kindness, compassion, and genuine love are powerful weapons. Dark entities cannot remain where these flourish. Seventh, use the authority of my name. When you sense darkness, command it to leave in the name of Jesus Christ. This authority has been given to all believers, though few exercise it. Eighth, recognize that not all who channel darkness do so knowingly. Some have been deceived, taught practices they believe are beneficial. Pray for them to recognize the truth. Ninth, understand that medicine alone is insufficient. True healing encompasses body, mind, and spirit. Advocate for the whole person. Finally, share what you've learned with wisdom and discernment. Not to cause fear, but to awaken awareness so others can protect themselves and their loved ones. Why are hospitals such centers for spiritual warfare? Hospitals exist at the intersection of life and death, suffering and healing, hope and despair, Jesus explained. They are places of transition and vulnerability. The enemy targets hospitals for the same reason predators target the weak in a herd: they are easier to bring down. He showed me how different spiritual forces competed for influence in these settings. Forces of light seek to bring healing, comfort, and when it's truly time, peaceful transition to eternal life. Forces of darkness seek to extend suffering, prevent healing, cause premature death, and most importantly, separate souls from God at the moment of transition. I watched as certain hospital staff moved through their day surrounded by light, nurses who prayed for patients while providing care, doctors who saw their work as a calling rather than just a job, chaplains who brought genuine spiritual comfort. Their presence pushed back the darkness wherever they went. These are my agents in this battle, Jesus said. Most don't fully comprehend the spiritual dimension of their work, but they feel it intuitively. They know that something beyond physical care is needed for true healing. Then Jesus showed me that this spiritual battle wasn't limited to one hospital or one area. It was happening in medical facilities worldwide. The methods vary by culture, he explained. In some places, dark practices are integrated openly with medicine. In others, they're hidden beneath a veneer of science and professionalism. But the battle is universal. He showed me hospitals in different countries, each with its own manifestation of this spiritual warfare. In some cultures, certain medical practices incorporated rituals that actually invited dark entities. In others, folk healers worked alongside modern medicine, some bringing light and others darkness. Discernment is crucial, Jesus emphasized. Not all traditional healing is dark, and not all modern medicine is light. Judge by the fruits and by what is revealed to your spirit. I saw how darkness especially targeted certain patients, the very young, the very old, the mentally ill, and those with no one to advocate for them. The most vulnerable require the most protection, Jesus said. Yet they often receive the least. This is where my people must be most vigilant. Then Jesus explained how faith created protection in medical settings. Those with active faith bring light with them wherever they go. Even if they cannot see the spiritual battle, they participate in it through their prayers and their presence. He showed me patients who, despite serious diagnoses, recovered unexpectedly because they were surrounded by people of faith who refused to accept negative prognoses and instead declared life and healing. Faith doesn't guarantee physical healing in every case, Jesus clarified. Sometimes it is truly a person's appointed time to transition from this life. But faith ensures that transition happens in light, not darkness, and prevents premature separation of spirit from body. I watched as a dying believer was surrounded by family members who prayed and sang hymns. The dark entities that normally clustered around the dying couldn't approach this patient. Instead, beings of light waited to escort the soul when the appointed moment came. This is a peaceful transition, Jesus explained, the kind that all should experience. Not rushed by darkness, not extended unnecessarily by medical intervention, but occurring in its proper time, surrounded by light. As our journey through the spiritual reality of hospitals approached its end, Jesus brought me to a quiet garden outside the hospital. "What you've seen is heavy knowledge to carry," he acknowledged. "But it's necessary. Too many suffer unnecessarily because those who could protect them lack awareness." He placed his hands on my shoulders and looked deeply into my eyes. "You will return now, Sarah. You'll recover from your heart attack, though the journey won't be easy. You'll remember what you've seen, not all at once, but as you need it. When you encounter situations like those I've shown you, recognition will come, and with it, the knowledge of what to do." "Will people believe me if I tell them?" I asked. "Some will," Jesus replied. "Others won't be ready to hear. Share with wisdom and discernment. Not to cause fear, but to awaken awareness so my people can protect themselves and their loved ones." He showed me glimpses of my future, conversations with colleagues who would listen, patients I would help protect, families I would guide in speaking life rather than death over their loved ones. "This is your new purpose," Jesus said. "You'll continue your work in respiratory therapy, but with new eyes and new understanding. You'll be my witness in a place where few recognize the battle that rages around them." Then he embraced me, and in that embrace, I felt love beyond anything I'd ever experienced. Perfect love that cast out all fear, despite the darkness I'd witnessed. "Remember," he said as the scene began to fade, "darkness cannot stand against light. Evil cannot prevail where my name is proclaimed. Death has no power over those who place their trust in me." With those words echoing in my consciousness, I felt myself being pulled back, rushing toward my body. There was a moment of resistance, then pain, intense, crushing chest pain that reminded me immediately of my physical condition. Then suddenly I awoke in the ICU. Every detail of my near-death experience was vivid, a miraculous encounter that shattered my old understanding of life and death. I soon learned that my return was not a twist of fate but a purposeful gift, a call to share hope and healing with others. I discovered that the battles fought in the unseen spiritual realm are met with an even greater power, the unyielding light of God's love. In the days that followed, I began to embrace this newfound purpose. Returning to work as a respiratory therapist, I now move through hospital corridors with a deep sense of gratitude and determination. Each patient, each colleague, serves as a reminder that every moment is an opportunity to bring comfort and inspire faith. I've learned to speak words of encouragement and to pray with fervor, creating a protective shield around those vulnerable souls in our care. My journey has taught me that even when darkness seems to prevail, the light of Christ is always within reach. No matter how heavy the burdens or how deep the despair, hope remains. Let my testimony remind you that every day is a new beginning, a chance to embrace love, to fight fear with faith, and to know that you are never alone. God's light shines in every corner, guiding us through even the darkest times.